Welcome to the Antedote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
Well, today is part 3 of our series that we're doing. I think it may go another episode after this. We've titled From 9/11 to 11/9, and that relates, of course, to the dates of September 11th, and then, of course, November 9th, 2016, the morning of Donald Trump was actually elected president. And just tying the parallels between the two events, and just how I think understanding what appears to likely have happened on November 9th, 2016, and just a lot of the players involved and a lot of the aspects related to that can help us, I think, in a lot of ways actually help to shed further light on what may have actually happened on September 11th. And we're using a number of different metrics to analyze this. And in our last show, we discussed this Wayne Madsen article that was, I believe it was actually published within the framework of WikiLeaks, just exposing the depths of the Israeli connections to the alleged 9/11 hijackers, which have been used as the key focal point of the narrative that Saudi Arabia was actually the culprit behind September 11th. And Jeremy, I know you wanted to just start off by sharing some information that would be a good follow-up on what we discussed last week regarding some of the more, perhaps some of the more physical evidence of possible elements of the September 11th operation.
Yes, and maybe before I do that, we're recording here on September 10th of 2018, the day before September 11th this year. And this year, 9/11 falls on a Tuesday, just as it did on 9/11/01. And there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of geopolitical tension in the air right now. A lot of it in terms of different state actors making accusations against each other, and also what's going to go on in Syria, what's currently going on in Syria in terms of Idlib, and we pray for people worldwide, but right now we definitely focus on prayers for the Syrian people and those in Idlib. And then what's also interesting this year is that September 11th is also, there's a conjunction of the Jewish New Year. Rosh Hashanah ends tomorrow, and then the Islamic New Year. So there's a lot of sense of concern in terms of the symbolic and the occult overlay sometimes, and the numerological and the sort of historical symbology sometimes that seems to be packed into some of these incidents, along with things like the gematria and that sort of more occult aspect of some of these incidents that are usually done in relationship to things like geopolitics, I think are also adding to some of the concern that I can feel. I can feel it in my heart and in my gut. And so prayers and intention for the wiser heads amongst us to intervene and to bind any wicked action that is in planning right now. And so in doing so, we also then are beginning to understand some of these threads that we've been tying together in terms of talking about from 9/11 to 11/9, and some of the threads that show themselves in terms of continuity, but then also some of the different players that have entered more prominently in relationship to something like the Trump operation, where you see much more a focus in relationship to Russia, versus, I would say, in comparing and contrasting to 9/11 to Saudi Arabia. But there's also the commonality there in terms of the architecture of the construction, I would say, of the operation in many ways. And that if you look at September 11th, it clearly happens in the United States of America. There are elements in the U.S. that are knowing and pretty obviously involved in aspects of it. It's probably a small cluster of people at certain key nodal points within the U.S. national so-called security architecture. But then when you look down to the sort of foreign state actors in the background of September 11th, the two main ones that really stick out are Israel and Saudi Arabia. And yes, other people have sort of thrown in things about Pakistan and the ISI connections allegedly to the hijackers and all of that. And much of that comes down to things such as like this alleged wire transfer of money that showed up in a story in the India Times, and I haven't seen any follow-up about that and whether that actually happened or whether that was just completely black propaganda. But certain people who call themselves 9/11 truthers, so-called, will just focus on this one story from the Times, the Indian newspaper, about this wire transfer from the head of ISI to an alleged hijacker, and say that sort of like shows that Pakistan is at the center of the 9/11 conspiracy. But virtually everyone being at least somewhat honest about September 11th, even if they haven't come to some of these deeper aspects of the truth about the architecture about September 11th, will at least admit that Israel and Saudi Arabia are in the background of the September 11th operation, even if one is considering it as this idea that is put on the surface that Osama bin Laden attacked the United States partially because of its support, an unquestioning support for Israel. And
also, it's interesting you just mentioned Israel and Saudi Arabia as being at the center of 9/11, but also it's Israel and Saudi Arabia in a lot of ways are at the center of what we call 11/9, within terms of the primary foreign policy goal of the Trump administration is the remaking. It appears, at least in that region of the world, is the remaking of the region, with the Saudi Arabia and a lot of the other Arab kingdoms getting closer to Israel even than before in the past. And so there was a lot of maneuvering going on with events related to Israel and the Arab kingdoms going on before the election as well as after the election inauguration of Trump. So that's a commonality there with the primary Israeli-Saudi Arabia role in both of these events, I would say.
Yeah, and we might even be able to say that a lot has shifted in relationship to Israeli-Arab relations, where we're talking about post-Arab Spring, and now what we've covered on the Antedote in terms of this very blatant now Sunni Arab Israeli alliance that has been drawn together in relationship to against Iran. So we're now living in those years where you actually can really see Saudi Arabia as a sort of an extension or a very direct partner, geopolitical partner with Israel, and whether that was the case before on September 11th, I don't know, but it's become very, very clear. But the new element, I would say, in terms of the 11/9 operation, so if you think about 9/11 as it was the Saudi patsies with the Israeli masterminds with U.S. elements involved, and that would be my shorthand assertion. On 11/9, you see something more like Russia as a proxy, potentially, as an active proxy, it looks like more and more to me, a very active proxy who had their own interests in relationship to having cultivated Donald Trump via Russian mob circles and the money there and the Russian oligarchs for decades and decades and decades, and all of that fed back into the state intelligence channels of the Russian government. So that's there. But then once again, you see an Israeli background and potentially mastermind here in terms of the 11/9 operation. And that's what's so intriguing about this, is that on the surface you have all this obvious Russia connection to Donald Trump in terms of his money background and all of that. That's really right on the surface for anyone to look at it, in terms of Manafort now having actually been convicted. That was obviously his relationship with Yanukovych and running operations there, that actually there's a lot of similarities in relationship to Manafort's operations in Ukraine in relationship to Yanukovych to the operations that he was involved with in the 11/9 operation here domestically in the United States. And then we talked about before about how there was this transition from Manafort to Bannon in the Trump campaign, and in certain ways, you see that the Manafort as a key player sort of harkens to looking into his immediate background in relationship to this Russian sphere and this Russian oligarch sphere and this Russian mob sphere, and then you take it into Bannon, and Bannon is much more seemingly tied directly into these more domestic and Israeli connections in relationship to the Mercers, in relationship to the CNP, and then directly into Zionist Organization for America and Breitbart having been formed at the table with Netanyahu. And so I think you begin to see it in a certain way that these what are seen as sort of foreign hands are in the mix there in relationship directly to who's managing the Trump campaign at different points in the election season. So, but this is front and center now more and more in terms of Russiagate or whatever we want to call it. Like we were talking about before, there is an interesting parallel here in terms of those that either will not discuss any of it. A lot of it is very blatant open source stuff, things like Manafort's connection to Dmitry Firtash, and then Firtash's connection deep into the heart of the Russian mob connections, Semyon Mogilevich, and then also into the Russian security establishment and Putin as a former intelligence officer, or an ongoing intelligence officer in a certain way. It's sort of like you could sort of see it as George H.W. Bush, right? A CIA officer then takes the helm of the executive branch. And but so you see that. So there's a whole group of people that won't deal with the plain factual dynamics of the Russia connection, Russian mob connection, Russian oligarch connection to Trump and his background, to his campaign, to the key people in his campaign, to the money laundering, even now into potentially into this aspect of Kavanaugh and the background with Justice Kennedy and the sons of Justice Kennedy, the way they're tied into the Trump family, and one of them, Justin Kennedy, having the background at the Deutsche Bank, which became the lone sort of American representative bank that would actually loan Donald Trump money at some point. And then also these are the same years where Deutsche Bank is obviously involved in billions and billions of dollars of washing money out of Russia and through the Russian mob. And now you have Kavanaugh being sort of thrown in right after the Mueller gets named the special counsel. And Kavanaugh's name gets added to the Federalist list, basically, of Supreme Court judges for Donald Trump to consider. And Kavanaugh is in the White House on September 11th, was at the table for conversations around things like he at least had knowledge of things like torture, spying, these kinds of things. And by the way, I did notice when Lindsey Graham, who's another suspicious actor in the mix of all of this for many, many years. When Graham asked Kavanaugh to describe where he was on September 11th, Kavanaugh talked about how they emerged. They were in the White House. They emerged out of the White House, and then he noted that his wife was with him and was wearing a black and white chessboard or checkerboard type of shirt. So I got a sort of Masonic type ring out of that. And so, all right, so that's a little bit far afield here. But then back to this issue of the relationship of 9/11, where you have Saudi patsies, Israeli masterminds, and U.S. elements involved. 11/9, you have this Russia involvement. Maybe it's a proxy, Israeli background, and then U.S. involvement, obviously. And you have a similar type of scenario with both 9/11 and 11/9 in terms of the kind of groups of people that are not willing to deal with sort of the surface allegations, things such as the Saudi connection, which sort of has just developed over the years, but then increasingly with 11/9 with the Russia connection. And then there are those who will deal with the Russia connection who cannot see the Israeli background, which is very, very blatant. And by the way, there's this new film out called Active Measures, which is very much sort of like I sort of see it as like the U.S. establishment's perspective and propaganda about this moment in history and about the Russia and Trump operation. And in the mix of that is a lot of factual basis that a lot of other folks have been looking at that is very damning in relationship to Trump and his Russian mobbed up background. And what's interesting to me is for people like us who can read the tea leaves a little bit and see the threads that are mixed in there that are not being drawn out, which is so obviously the aspect of the Russian mob that's Jewish, first of all, and then also how that is tied very much back in to these high-level operations out of the Jewish state, Israel, and Netanyahu as this obviously close figure. Netanyahu's not mentioned once in the film, but the film opens up early on with a reference to how the way that the Russian mob was sort of came into the United States in a big way was done by one Henry Scoop Jackson, basically the big neocon, congressman who helped create an immigration policy, an act to allow in Soviet Jews. And then the film says under that cover, the Soviets opened up the gulags and a lot of Russian crime connected mobsters also used that as an advantage to come out. So that's an interesting piece of the puzzle. Go for it.
Oh, I was going to say in that regard, you mentioned Netanyahu, and I think a lot of researchers, as far as who are really serious about researching and exposing the obvious Israeli, not just involvement, but in a lot of ways masterminding of the 9/11 operation, have identified Benjamin Netanyahu as perhaps even being the key, as one of the, if not maybe even at the end of the day, the main 9/11 culprit as far as in a lot of ways. And of course, it was Netanyahu who stated that 9/11 was good for Israel. Of course, he tried to correct himself immediately afterwards, but he said that. And then, you have Trump. We some of the stuff we went through last week here, I'm repeating a little bit, but I feel it bears repeating because it's important to this whole narrative that we're trying to lay out here, and that Trump was the only American, possibly the only American non-Jewish potential donor listed by Netanyahu himself as potential American donor to his campaign. And then Trump goes and makes a campaign ad for Israel. And I would say globally in a lot of ways, maybe outside of elements of those who want, I guess, quote unquote, détente with Russia, and then a lot of the American right-wing conservative movement, I'd say the people who have benefited globally, it seems in a lot of ways, if you really look at it, you get all the really look at it, I think, from what we can see and what is on the surface that we can obviously look at factual evidence. The people that have benefited, it seems to me, the most out of Trump's election and the election of bringing in the more hardline elements of the Trump administration that have replaced some of the more moderate figures, maybe your McMasters and your Tillersons, have been, I think, the Israelis, and particularly the right wing in Israel, and that being the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, which is always the first, it seems like, to compliment Donald Trump on just about anything he does. So I think you look at Netanyahu himself as being a key figure in the 9/11 and 11/9 operations as it directly relates to Israel. So I just want to throw that in there.
I think that's a core point. Netanyahu as the key figure in that connects 9/11 to 11/9. Exactly. There it is. And what's interesting, back to this Active Measures film, is the sort of, if the Scoop Jackson involvement in the Soviet Jewish Immigration Act is sort of key to the import of the Russian mob aspect into the United States. And by the way, just an aside here, the people who are, all into the sort of the Q type, the InfoWars Breitbart type, a focus on such figures as Bruce Orr, or people like that, should go actually look at Bruce Orr's background in targeting for actions under the Department of Justice the Russian mob. So is this really just some type of Russian mob cover-up under the guise of rooting out the deep state and the deep state traitors? I think people should go look at that and see if there's something going on with that. And that is a common thing here in terms of the people that are being attacked. Is there that includes Steele, that includes what's his name, the journalist that we've covered briefly, who worked for the Wall Street Journal before. What's his? You remember Glenn Simpson? Glenn Simpson,
yes, and even to an extent, Mueller himself and James Comey to an extent too.
That is true, and there Semyon Mogilevich was on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted at some point, and people such as Manafort and his relationship with Bob Dole, even people like Bob Dole, I believe, were involved in advocating for things like getting Mogilevich off of that. I don't know if I haven't followed that up, but that's in the background there. And so the commonality, though, in terms of the people who are being focused on, whether it's Christopher Steele or they all have a background in relationship to some of this connection between the Russian mob and Russian intelligence. And so that is pretty interesting, if you think about it. So then back to this active measures film, if the front end is Scoop Jackson, the sort of arch neocon congressman, and who's has an institute named after him, that's all still at the heart of the people who are surrounding the Trump operation and the Gaffneys and all of that. Then on the back end, one of the last scenes is at the Trump inauguration, and when you see Trump at the podium, you see just a few faces that I can make out, and one of them is Barack Obama, and behind him is Dan Quayle. But the most joyous face popping out on the other side, on the viewer's left side, is Sheldon Adelson's wife. What's her name again?
Miriam Adelson.
Miriam Adelson. She is just overjoyed and very, very close for a private citizen. So there you go. So that's right in the background there. And then in the middle of the active measures film, it talks about this key speech, this key moment at the Mayflower Hotel when Trump was beginning to outline his national security advisors and plan, and this is when things that had to do with Russian interests were apparently inserted into the campaign plans, and then they mentioned the Center for the National Interest, run by Dimitri Simes, who's now come back into the news with this Butina arrest, and how Butina was having conversations, and I believe in relationship to torsion, to one Maurice Hank Greenberg, who's on the board, who I believe chairs the board, who's an honorary chair of the board for the Center for the National Interest, along with one Henry Kissinger. And so people might want to go back to our antidote about who's in charge. Trump, Kissinger, or Mega, I think is something like that.
Yeah.
And then we just briefly read through who else is on the board of the Center for the National Interest. You have Henry Kissinger, Hank Greenberg, and let me remind people who Hank Greenberg really is. Maurice Greenberg. He's been deeply embedded in at the conjunction of the highest levels of U.S. Corporate establishment and the U.S. Intelligence establishment at the same time. And it looks very much like there's a deep tie back to Israel, very likely. And Hank Greenberg headed up AIG, which also was, I believe, the parent company of Marsh McClellan, which was a key location in the trade towers on September 11th in terms of the original impacts. But then also Kroll, the corporate intelligence group that was in control of the human security at the trade towers in the run-up to September 11th, was also under the control of Hank Greenberg's AIG.
I'm glad you mentioned the Greenberg, Kissinger, Marsh McLennan, because Marsh McLennan, of course, is where Paul Bremer was the head of, which he miraculously missed work and went on TV to blame Osama bin Laden within hours while hundreds of his employees were dying. And as a quick aside, I would say that you mentioned the Miriam Adelson at the inauguration. We did an episode covering this New Yorker article, Trump's New World Order, which basically is about the remaking of the Middle East under Trump in the kind of the connection and the nexus and the bringing together of Israel with the Arab kingdoms under the eye of Trump and people like Jared Kushner. I believe it was Sergei Lavrov, the Russian ambassador to the U.S., was quoted as saying that, pointing, I believe it may have been at Ron Dermer, and saying that this man is the most important person at the inauguration. So you have that too.
That's very interesting. And then also the inauguration is a key locus too, in terms of it looks very possible that the inauguration itself was a Russian mob money laundering potential operation. And you see some of these oligarchs that we've talked about before who are front and center there, including people like Blavatnik. And what I would imagine is in the background are some of these more, people who have been put on lists, such as the money of people like Dmitry Firtash, Oleg Deripaska, people who are much more deeply in the Russian sphere. So we have Kissinger and Greenberg on the board of Center for the National Interest, and then you also have one Dov Zakheim, who was a head of the Pentagon's Inspector General. No, not Inspector General. What was the
comptroller?
He was the comptroller, exactly. So the day after Donald Rumsfeld announces the $2.3 trillion that are unaccounted for
basically oversaw the Pentagon, the money going in the Pentagon.
Yes, and so then you have one Dov Zakheim who's tied into not only the money at the Pentagon, but then also is tied into such firms that deal in things like remote controlling of aircraft and that type of thing. But also, I believe he was at Booz Allen Hamilton ultimately. And I believe it's the case, people should research this, and there's a lot of focus. I know that my focus has largely been about, in terms of what actually happened on September 11th around the World Trade Centers. There's a few reasons for that. One is because that's where the majority of the murder and the destruction happened. The other thing is that it's the most open, sourceable. We have multiple videos and audio and investigations of the physical evidence there, and eyewitnesses that we can see being interviewed on that morning, as opposed to what happened at the Pentagon, which I think is also very important, obviously, because the military epicenter was attacked. So that's a key piece. Also, it's in D.C., so there is a sense of that's the attack on the capital power, the government power of the United States of America, and the attack on the World Trade Center is on the sort of the financial power, the commerce power. And so I believe that's symbolic, and there is a lot there in terms of the Pentagon that I'm beginning to return to, and I'm seeking input from people who've done a lot more research on that than me in terms of what actually happened at the Pentagon. But what I know about the Pentagon already is that things like, it looks very important about what was targeted at the Pentagon. The offices that were targeted, it looks like it is very much in the realm of things like Abel Danger, things like some of the accountants who were looking into things like this so-called missing $2.3 trillion, and then some aspect potentially that ties into naval intelligence. And I may be wrong about that, but that's what I've learned so far. And then the other part about the Pentagon that I see it as very similar in a certain way to the World Trade Center is that because September 11th was a sadistic sort of demonic magic trick of some sort, that there's the obsession over sort of what did or didn't hit when these buildings is actually the magician's wand in many ways, and is sort of a distraction from the actual core of the sadistic trick itself, which is actually
to pick up on something you said a minute ago about naval intelligence being involved with the whole here's in your eyes the Pentagon operation with regard to September 11th. I don't know if this is quite related or not, but I believe it was John Lehman, who was the former head of the Navy, was one of the people who came out and said that Saudi Arabia was behind 9/11, that we need to expose the Saudi role. He was very vocal and public about it. So I don't know if that's related at all to that.
Yeah, and I guess part of it was that it looked like elements of naval intelligence were targeted on September 11th, along with elements of Able Danger and these accountants. And so what it looks like is it's similar to the World Trade Centers. There's a lot of people trying to get you to focus on the nature of the external impacts. It's also a symbol for the idea of the hijackers, the outside threat, rather than who had the opportunity and the means to get it from the inside. And so it looks like you have targeted explosions of some sort, both at the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. And so we'll return to that maybe in the future. But so for now, I just want to, before we get deeper into this question of the ongoing Newsweek articles and the ongoing putting forth of the limited hangout operation that's sort of focused on the Saudis in relationship to 9/11, and I would say focused on the Russians in relationship to 11/9, we have this tripartite concept of the military aspects of September 11th, which is what actually happened, the destruction of people and buildings, actual attacks. There's the intelligence part of it, which has to do with the legend, and this is what we really focused on last week in terms of reading the Wayne Madsen article about the background of the apparent Israeli intelligence cultivation and shaping of the so-called al-Qaeda cells that were then framed for September 11th, and September 11th as a quote-unquote hijacking operation from outside. And then we have this issue of the counterintelligence, which is the ongoing cover-up of the narrative itself, which makes its way, is pervasive basically, and makes its way into lots of different political and media sectors in many different ways. What we're seeking to do is to understand those different counterintelligence psychological attacks on all of us, while also unpacking what the actual truth in the middle of that is. So before we move on to that, I just want to get into maybe somewhere closer to the relationship of the military aspects of September 11th to the intelligence aspects of September 11th. How do you actually run a treasonous operation internally through the domestic bureaucracy? And so I want to deal with things like looking at a few of these war games and terror drills that were running in relationship to September 11th. Some of them actually at the exact same time, and some of them more surrounding September 11th. And so I'm going to play a quick clip from a We Are Change LA video from more than 10 years ago, I believe. Or actually 10 years ago, from 2009, October 22nd, 2009, where I went to an event at the University of Southern California with a former Secretary of the Air Force, Thomas Reed. He was also a nuclear weapons designer, and he was the 6th director of the National Reconnaissance Office, which plays a key role because the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, was running a key mimetic drill on September 11th of a plane crashing into their building almost at the exact same time, I believe, as September 11th operation began. So I'm going to play this clip from this, and then we could talk about it a little bit.
Here is a 5-kiloton device detonated in the Los Angeles marina. Bad guys put it on a yacht, assembled it in because it's too big to meet the truck for a yacht, floated into the LA marina and fired it. This is what goes on. Los Angeles airport gone. All of Santa Monica on fire. But the circles are fallout because they would fire this on the surface, which produces more fallout. It means that like Baldwin Hills, everybody's dead. As far as the campus here, again,
he's talking about
featured right there.
Hypothetical
most of the people here are
weapon dirty bomb in LA or in other places.
That's a small terrorist device. That's the sort of thing. It may not happen at the LA Marina. It may be floated up the Hudson River. It may be floated at the Anacostia River in Washington. But the point is, you've got to pay attention because That is a very distinct possibility. Bad guys can do that once they get their hands on fissile materials.
Questions this moment? There's a question right here.
Okay, now I'm going to ask about these drills.
Thank you very much. Multiple national security insiders have spoken about the policy coup that took place in the wake of 9/11. And so with the expertise of this panel, I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to ask a question about the role that the inside or interstitial threat of nuclear terror might have played in the 9/11 operation itself. And this is best asked by briefly laying out a series of confluent war games and terror drills that were being run on 9/11, many of them mimetic of the attacks themselves. First of all, we had these aerial terror games where Vigilant Warrior, Vigilant Guardian, Live Fly, Hijack drills. We also have the National Reconnaissance Office, of which Mr. Reed, I think, was the 6th director.
Mr. Reed was the 6th director.
A plane flying into the building.
Plane flying into their building.
And then quickly, there were biochemical terror drills going on outside of Manhattan with FEMA and the Army.
That was in Tripod 2.
And this is very pertinent in terms of this panel. There was nuclear terror or warfare drills going on. One of them, Global Guardian, which had to do with STRATCOM and had to do with a nuclear warfare scenario. And then Operation Jackal Cave, which had to do with the Department of Energy's secret nuclear bomb squad. They were out of the country for the first time in 3 years to do a drill undoing a device. So the question is, the question is, in light of all these mimetic war games, and we know that operational coups are done under cover of drills, what is the relationship of the potential threat of nuclear terrorism to the apparent treason infecting the deep bowels of the national security apparatus?
My response is I'm not familiar with all the war games that were going on before 9/11, but this, trying to think through how you deal with those things are terribly important. I think that's where I ended up this evening, is that I think an important role for a university like this is to get those discussions out in the open, to have a convocation on what are we going to do when that sort of thing happens. Do the drills and exercises cause the problem? No, I don't think so. Any more than medicines cause the disease. But there's a lot of subterranean games, thinking about it, go on. But I think what are we going to do really needs the public ventilation that a university can bring to bear.
Would you say it's a coincidence that all of these games are running on 9/11 that mime what actually happened? Are you saying that?
Yeah, in short answer, yeah. I don't think they're connected.
So that's that. And he ultimately, I talked to him afterwards, and he was very friendly with me. And so I just wanted to play that because it was a breaking down of what I actually think might be hanging in the background in terms of September 11th as a military and intelligence operation and the fusion of those two categories. And that there was this overarching nuclear component to September 11th in terms of the threat matrix and all of that. And I think that, before we just spend the rest of the show talking about the aspects of the cover-up and the Saudi limited hangout and all of that, I wanted to bring up these drills because I believe they're the epicenter of the evidence that speaks to what actually happened and how September 11th was actually done. And they're very, very convincing pieces of data when you tie it together with things like the hard evidence of the World Trade Center. And so some of these drills, and I mentioned there was this National Reconnaissance plane into the building drill. Jackal Cave, I believe, is a very critical drill that is almost never talked about in aspects of the 9/11 truth movement, but I think it's very very interesting because I think I brought it up last week that there was this threat on October 11th, exactly a month after September 11th, about a nuclear threat in Manhattan, and that same squad, that nuclear squad, was sent to deal with that. So, like, for example, right now, we go look at the historycommons.org. It's a great resource. The context of October 11th, 2001, nuclear bomb squad sent to New York following intelligence report of possible al-Qaeda device. Okay, and you get into it. September 10th through 15th, 2001. Nuclear response team is away from the U.S. for a counterterrorism exercise in Europe. Members of the Department of Energy's Nuclear Emergency Search Team, NEST, are away from America when it comes under terrorist attack, taking part in a training exercise in Europe called Jackal Cave. Jackal Cave, which is run by the U.S. military's Joint Special Operations Command, involves participants tracking down a hypothetical force made up of terrorists and organized criminals who are trafficking in weapons of mass destruction, or quote-unquote loose nukes. Over 500 personnel, 62 aircraft, and 420 tons of cargo are involved in the exercise. 3 components of NEST are taking part: the Lincoln Gold Augmentation Team, the Nuclear Radiological Advisory Team, and the Joint Technical Operations Team. The NEST personnel are in Europe by September 10th, if not before then, for the exercise. So I think that is very, very telling. I believe this is the first time they were out of the country in 3 years. And then even making sort of the way that we're making parallel links between 9/11 and 11/9, there's also parallel links to be made between 9/11 and the JFK assassination. For example, this pattern of certain groups or certain people being sent out of the country right before the key event, I think are common. For example, some of the key, like, for example, Mr. X, Fletcher Prouty, Mr. X in the film JFK by Oliver Stone, as we pointed out before, financed by Arnon Milchan, thus some aspect of Israeli technical intelligence, basically financed that film. But Fletcher Prouty as Mr. X in that film, he was the key go-between between the Pentagon and the CIA, I believe, at that time, and he was out of the country away. I think he was actually in Australia, and like he was in the southern hemisphere, and he observed the way that some of the story about who did it was being put out almost beforehand, and before anyone could have known who did it, and so he was observing that type of thing. Meanwhile, who was actually in town, meaning like in Dallas, we have reports of people like George H.W. Bush, people like maybe Rabin, other Israeli elements being in town that day. But that also is the same on September 11th. You have such groups as I mentioned before, this Jackal Cave, the nuclear bomb squad of the United States being out of the country. But you also have the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually being out of the country on 9/11. So that's what puts Richard Myers, who ultimately sort of becomes the head of it at the core, the acting head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on September 11th. Major parts of the FBI counterterrorism groups were out of the East Coast. Some of them, I believe, were in California, and some of them were in Montana for a security seminar. I believe Secretary of State Colin Powell was out of the country at the time. And then, of course, the key one is George W. Bush was out of D.C. and the main command posts in terms of being the commander-in-chief. And he ended up flying all around under apparent threat in terms of these code words of Angel is next on September 11th as a code word for the Air Force One being under some type of threat. So that's why I brought up that idea of Jackal Cave, this operation, nuclear, missing nuke operation with this bomb squad being out of the country. And then there's also Tripod 2, which I mentioned, which was being run via FEMA and aspects of the Army. It was a biowarfare drill. It looks probably like someone like Jerome Hauer was probably involved in helping manage that for the Department of Health. And that they set up a peer, an alternative command center from World Trade Center 7, which I believe it was Giuliani and Jerome Hauer who had first decided to put the emergency command center for the mayor of New York in Building 7. And so at the very same time, for Tripod 2, they'd set up this alternative command center ultimately, which I believe became their go-to command center as the September 11th operation began going under the guise of the Tripod 2 biowarfare drill, which followed on, by the way, this dark winter anthrax type warfare drill the summer before September 11th that included also people like Jerome Howard, and even, I believe, people like Judith Miller. Judith Miller played the journalist, unquote, in the Dark Winter game that anticipated the anthrax attacks after September 11th. So, but then there was also what I mentioned, things like Vigilant Warrior, Vigilant Guardian, which were actually some of the live fly hijack drills that were apparently running. But then this game of Global Guardian, which was a nuclear warfare game that also puts Russia into the mix, and the raising of the DEFCON level on September 11th, and is I believe key piece of the nuclear umbrella under which September 11th took place. But I'll put all of that aside for now, and maybe we can head a little bit more deeply into this issue of the Newsweek, the Saudis, and all of that. Greg, you want to? Greg? Okay, I seem to have lost Greg, but I'm going to keep on going here. And so there's more in terms of this nuclear umbrella. But just by the way, there's a very interesting recent development in the Trump administration where Trump has brought in a woman named Samantha Ravitch to be sort of head of his national security advisory group, it looks like. And she comes out of working with Michael Chertoff's group. She comes out of being Dick Cheney's national security assistant during some of the Bush years. She worked with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which now has been exposed to be seen as basically an Israeli government proxy in relationship to things about Israeli propaganda and countering boycott, divestment, sanction. And then she's also worked with WINEP and all of that. But I bring her up, though. I'll link to an article about her out of If Americans Knew, Allison Weir's blog. Basically, it's headlined, Israel Advocate Ravitch named to senior intelligence post, planned U.S.-Israel cyber project against BDS. And if you go look into a video of her talking about it, to me, it looks like there's a shift from this idea of the nuclear umbrella, which was always seen as the idea of U.S. Influence, security influence around the world, and that Asia, but also Eastern Europe, would be under the nuclear umbrella, the defense umbrella, in relationship to the United States. And that was specifically more during the Cold War. But now during the war on terror, or the terror wars, Samantha Ravitch, in this video of her speaking, has said that she is proposing a U.S., Israel, UK cyber agreement, cyber project, to then offer the world what I would call a terror umbrella. And she talks about it in a way about it's very much tied into now what we know about the Talpiot program. And go look at Talpiot Talk resources that Joseph Davis has put on all about that will show also how this might also tie in to this larger geopolitical operation around 11/9 in the relationship to Russia, and then Israel's relationship to China also. So I think there's a shift now from this nuclear umbrella to the terror umbrella, and Ravitch is basically advocating that Israel is now, instead of being a junior partner, is now the key partner. Basically, it is now fully at the table and must be taken seriously as a cyber power on equal footing with the U.S. and then the U.K., and that together they can then offer this terror umbrella, or a counterterrorism umbrella, as it's probably being marketed distributed to Europe and the rest of the world.
Which no doubt the usual suspects, the Rita Katzes, will play a primary role in the very least disseminating information for this anti-terror umbrella, I'm sure. And I don't know, do you have anything else you want to say about this?
No, I'm glad you're back, because I'd like to get into this Newsweek article stuff with you.
Sure, I was having a little, I was hoping my connection's coming in well here and you're able to hear me well. Yeah, for sure. And we've got another show after this, so I guess we can continue on the topic on the next show. And I'm glad you brought all that up, and this very much, I think you've laid out a strong case for tying a lot of these dots together that for whatever reason a lot of other people haven't, and it's kind of just capitalizing on the great research that's already out there, and I think even bringing it to and updating it in terms of the landscape of 2018. So I hope that this is resonating with some people with regards to just tying these operations together, and really in a lot of ways what you might say is the continuing operation that really never ended actually on the day of September 11th. So anyway, with regards to this Newsweek article, we alluded to this last week and at the beginning of our show. Article, basically it was championing the creators of the film 9/11 Press for Truth in their new book. What is the title of the book again?
The Dog That Didn't Bark or something like that. I think that's what it's called.
Dog That Didn't Bark. And so this article is basically what it's doing really is it's reinforcing the narrative that is somewhat accepted, actually pretty accepted in the mainstream framework, mainstream conversation, that Saudi Arabia was the primary culprit on September 11th. And
it's called The Watchdogs Didn't Bark, the CIA, NSA, and the Crimes of the War on Terror.
Okay. And so this article basically is reinforcing the narrative that I think was really put out there at first almost immediately with I think some of the activism of the original 9/11 accountability efforts with family members, that even people who very much in the future were opposed to or were very much not taking any type of stance on 9/11, people like, say, Van Jones or even Howard Zinn, who initially endorsed some of the accountability efforts before I think some of the more scientific type of research came in. Medea Benjamin of Code Pink. And what was started there, what I think really picked up with the release of Fahrenheit 9/11 by Michael Moore. By the way, Michael Moore and Donald Trump both have Ari Emanuel as their agent. And then as recent years has picked up even more with the push for the 28 pages and the this whole, what we're going to get into, I think, here at the end of this show and in the beginning of our next show, the JASTA Accountability Act, which involves at the center of that is a 9/11 family member whose husband died in the World Trade Center, Terry Strada. But basically with this article, you're seeing a reinforcing of the Saudis did it narrative. And I think in the few minutes we have here, as well as in our next program, we're going to talk about we're going to break down this article and some of the things that are in it, and also some of the people that are shaping the Saudis did it narrative and why this is problematic and why this is key to the ongoing 9/11, not just perhaps operation, but also just the cover up as we've known it's been going on for 17 years now.
Yes, and one last thing that I forgot to mention in relationship to what I was talking about before around this secret nuclear bomb squad and why it was related to October 11th and the apparent threat from al-Qaeda of a nuclear device was, I'm just going to link to this. I'm not going to read from it. I just wanted to let people know is that there is a compendium of a story of lots of different stories that was collated on Rents, and it's titled Israeli NYC Embassy, a Radiation Hotspot, ? Near news blackout on this important story where the U.S. government did an analysis of some where there was radiological hotspots in New York City, and the Israeli New York City Embassy popped up very unexpectedly on that list. But yes, as you were talking about this Newsweek article and the follow up to how this goes back to the very earliest days of the 9/11 Truth movement, but also the involvement of family members, and now how it's been delivered over in many ways to one Terry Strada. And I would say right now there's a struggle in relationship to 9/11 family activism between one Bob McIlvaine, who has continued to tell his perception of the truth about how his son was killed on September 11th in the towers, and how it very much relates to an explosive event of some sort, and not about Saudi hijackers on planes, versus Terry Strada, who's, if you go look at her Twitter feed, it's a really it seems like straight out of like Frank Gaffney, David Horowitz, Breitbart, Robert Spencer. It's very much the sort of the Islamic threat, and so all of that. But looking at this article a little bit, maybe I should just read a little bit from this article to show how it's being framed. Okay, so here's the name of this article. CIA and Saudi Arabia conspired to keep 9/11 details secret, new book says, by Jeff Stein, under Spy Talk at Newsweek. And this came out at the end of August 28th, 2018. And by the way, I just pulled up another Newsweek article written by Jeff Stein 3 years ago, June 19th of 2015. FBI agent, the CIA could have stopped 9/11. And it's basically the same characters who ultimately are again quoted in this updated article, saying pretty much the exact same thing. So it sort of reminds me of our conversations around Senator Bob Graham, and how Bob Graham would be floated every election cycle or every 4 years in some way with his story about how the Saudi connection was being covered up, and in a way to sort of discipline domestic elements in terms of the truth movement, I think, but also to discipline the Saudis in some way in terms of foreign policy. Okay, so back to this Newsweek article. Quote, "It's easier to bury uncomfortable facts than to confront them. So this September 11th, the ceremonies marking the 2001 attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. will simply honor the dead. In Manhattan, tourists and mourners will gather where the World Trade Center towers once stood, lowering their heads in memory of the 26,006 who perished there. The services won't reflect the view that the attacks might well have been prevented." Then it starts getting into talking about Ali Soufan, who's one of the lead FBI counterterrorism agents. He says, quote, "It's horrible. We still don't know what happened," unquote, and talks about how 9/11 changed the world. It not only led to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the fracturing of the Middle East, and the global growth of Islamic militantism, but also pushed the U.S. closer to being a virtual Homeland Security police state. That's an interesting statement, right? So I like that aspect of it. It sort of deals with reckons with some of the after effects. Greg, did you want to say something?
Sorry, my connection's just messing up here.
Okay, well, we're in our last...
That's why I've been silent most of the show. All
right, I'm sorry. We're in our last 30 seconds here, but then getting back down into that, they interview Duffy and Novoselsky, the authors of this book, and also they were the producers of Press for Truth, earlier 9/11 Truth documentary. And then it sort of goes into this whole aspect of Clark. This is Richard Clark's conspiracy theory, and I guess until next week we'll have to wait on that. But let's remember that James Baker once dismissed Richard Clark for being too pro-Israel. Right, Greg? All right, Greg. Until next week. Hopefully we'll have a better connection next week. And to everyone out there, thank you for your time. All right. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Antedote out.